UK is witnessing its worst rioting in 13 years. As you might know, these riots were triggered by a knife attack at a Taylor Swift themed dance party in Southport near Liverpool, in which three girls, aged 6, 7, and 9, were killed. Eight children and two adults were also injured. Rumors that spread in the aftermath led to spread of violence across cities. In several places, anti-immigration demonstrators have clashed with the police. In the latest incident, trouble flared in South Yorkshire on Sunday when masked anti-immigration demonstrators smashed several windows at a hotel that has been used to house asylum seekers. So far, over 100 people have been arrested. The government has issued statements saying far-right thuggery will not be tolerated. To talk to us about the latest, I'm joined by Mr. Adit Kothari. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Adit Kothari.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thanks for having me.
Mr. Kothari, while you are in India at this point in time, but your family is in UK, if you could tell us what you're hearing from friends and family, what's happening in the UK?
Sure, certainly. I mean, it's been an absolute tinderbox week for Britain. We've seen multiple number of riots flare up in various parts of Britain, and the government is basically blaming this on the far right. In my opinion, what they're doing is they're basically deflecting the blame to the far right instead of taking the appropriate measures. There is a certain sense within the people, within the various demographic of people, about two-tier policing. And we've seen that as well. The example that I wanted to cite was the Manchester incident at the airport, where there's video evidence of two Pakistani British men smashing the noses and basically beating up serving British police officers and hospitalizing them. As a consequence, 12 days have passed and no action, no charges have been pressed on those people. Whereas now Keir Starmer is basically coming out and demonstrating his two-tier stance on the far-right protests that have erupted as a consequence of the murders that happened in Southport. So there is a lot of angst within the people. The people are very nervous, and what happens is when you pander to a certain section of society and you do not pander to the other section of society, it's only eventually a matter of time that the other section does rise up, and that is what we're essentially seeing in Britain, where the white working middle class is certainly rising up to the institutions which have failed them.
Your wife is in London. What are you hearing from her? How worried are you about the well-being of your family and friends?
Well, we're quite worried about friends and family. For example, my wife has been told by her workplace that she should work from home and not travel into work. So that, it definitely points to the concerns that people have subconsciously, which is why they are encouraging people to stay home and work from home and not get out on the streets. London is not the same as it used to be 15 or 20 years back when I actually immigrated to London. Today, it's a very unsafe city. Crime is on a skyrocketing high. Knife crime followed by night crime. These are certainly challenges that we face, and obviously the consequence of the mayor of London being politically correct and playing to a certain gallery. That doesn't help the situation.
The riots are being phrased as conflict between anti-immigration, protesters, and of course, the Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, essentially Asians living in that part of the world, and of course, Africans as well.
So I think one term that comes to my mind is the South Asian terms, which is widely being used by the media. And the Indians and the Sri Lankans and the Chinese and everybody who is non-Pakistani or non-Bangladeshi have gone completely up in arms because they do not want to be bucketed in that same category as people who are, usually perceived as the problematic lot. So the Indians and the Sri Lankans and other Asians have not faced those kind of challenges yet. I mean, I myself was at the June rally of Tommy Robinson, and there was wide cry about racism and bigotry, etc., etc. I never faced any sort of bigotry so far. What they are vehemently and vociferously against is the political correctness of the polity, where they are allowing immigration of a certain kind, of a dubious nature, of the asylum seekers into the country, and as a consequence, the taxpayers' monies is being used to fund their stays in hotels, in other places which are quite expensive, while you're not being able to afford bills for your local residents and your average citizens. So that's the anger that the people are essentially
So you're
demonstrating.
saying, so you're saying the stabbing in Southport was just a trigger. The anger is caused by issues like illegal immigration, and of course, the government housing illegal immigrants, giving them certain facilities, perhaps which is being seen by natives as something which is happening at the cost of
Yeah.
UK citizens.
Absolutely. I mean, there's not an iota of doubt that there is this feeling within the population which the polity is not willing to address, and as a consequence, there are fissures in society which have erupted to these protests, and then thereby leading into rioting. Obviously, nobody condones the rioting. The rioting is the last thing that anybody would want to experience within a civil society, especially a civil moderate society like the British society. But there is a failure that the government must own up. And this is just not one government. It's just not the fault with the Keir Starmer government. It's the fault with the previous predecessors as well. So whether it be Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, anybody else, they have essentially failed to tackle this issue, which has been a long looming demand of the British citizens.
And why do you think that is? Because, of course, I mean, the Conservative government is not in power anymore. Labour government is in a position of power. Starmer is, of course, the new prime minister. So the parties, of course, have disagreements as far as their ideologies are concerned. But when it comes to this matter, as you were saying earlier, this has not been resolved by either. Why is that?
Well, it comes down to the policy making, right? So the policy making that the Keir Starmer government has inherited is straight away from the Rishi Sunak government, where they were essentially paying for hotel bills of the illegal asylum seekers, and that has definitely ruptured the relationships between the polity and the citizens of Britain, because, as you rightly mentioned, that they see the illegal immigrants being housed at the cost of an average British citizen who is actually struggling to pay for his bills, his food. Food inflation is on a skyrocketing high. People are not being able to afford their daily means, and when they see the kind of two-tier policies that the government has sort of executed, it certainly creates a lot of issues within that sort of demographics. So it's predominantly the white working class.
At this stage, of course, there have been few days that this has been going on. I'm talking about the clashes between protesters, of course, between the two groups, and then, of course, with the police. At this stage, how widespread these clashes are?
So the clashes or the protests are not as widespread as it's being reported in the media. So there are pockets where they've flared up, like you rightly reported, the hotel in Leeds, for example, or Southport, for example. There are places in Yorkshire which are flaring up, but there are pockets. Obviously, when the media covers these protests and these riots, it sort of amplifies in social media, and it gets a lot more coverage than it's truly the definition of the problem. So it's not as widespread as it's being reported, but it's certainly a problem, because somewhere or the other, subconsciously, this problem it sort of exists within people. People have also tried to engage with the polity, have tried to argue their points in a very civil manner. So what we're seeing in the shape of these protests are the absolute, disgruntlement with the polity and with the policymakers and the institutions. So ultimately, it's the institutions which have failed the people, where they see the two-tier policing, they see the two-tier policy making, and
Explain
that
that to
that's
us. Explain that to us a little bit, Mr. Kothari. What do you mean by two-tier policing?
So the Manchester incident, which I initially spoke about, it's been 12 days since that report was flagged up in the social media. Videos are available everywhere of the two British Pakistani men beating up the three serving police officers. And as a consequence, there has been nothing, no charges being pressed, because the police fear of some sort of rioting. And as a consequence, they do not want to take chances, and as a consequence, they are paralyzed to a certain degree. But the
So
same
you're
thing
saying
doesn't.
So you're saying the administration and authorities are siding with one faction while the other faction is being painted as a villain.
Yeah, and the same was seen even in Leeds, when there was, I think it was a week or so ago when there were riots in Leeds as a consequence of the child protection services, causing some sort of trauma within the gypsy community. And that sort of that had a ripple effect. And then you had the sort of pro-Palestinian Muslim gangs coming into play and rioting happening. And all the polity did is, they controlled the police. They did not allow the police to take the requisite measures. There was widespread vandalism, and there was absolutely nothing that could be heard from the polity that could make you believe that they were vociferously against that kind of rioting. So there is that sense of two-tier policing, and most infamously, Keir Starmer today is being termed as a two-tier Starmer. That's the nickname that people have essentially given to him.
Now, another problem, which is perhaps making situation worse, is the fact that both sides seem to be very organized. On one side, you have organizations like EDL, you were referring to Tommy Robinson earlier, and then the other side also seems to be very well organized. And these organized groups are clashing with each other in streets. And this is, of course, creating chaos in the UK as we know it.
Definitely, both sides are organized, and both sides seem to be galvanizing themselves quite willfully. Wearing masks, carrying the right kind of weapons to vandalize the streets. So they are definitely organized. But what we tend to see, or what we tend to acknowledge, that there is a sense of bigotry against the white working class by the polity. There is some sort of socialist snobbery which the white working class essentially feel, and as a consequence, they have essentially taken to the streets. The white working class coming to the streets is, it's happening after a very, very long time in Britain. This is not a common occurrence. It doesn't happen on a day-to-day basis. But what does happen on an average yearly basis is you see the average Islamists coming onto the streets and taking onto against the polity, against the institutions on some agenda or the other. Whether it be the grooming gang, which is defending the absolutely indefensible, right up to what happened in Manchester, whether we call it police brutality or not, the fact of the matter is that the police were feeling intimidated by the two assailants who basically knocked the police out, serving police out, and as a consequence, they had to resort to controlling them. So what I'm trying to say, Abhishek, is that both are organized, both are on the streets, but we've got to acknowledge that the policy making and the polity are pandering to a certain section and are basically blaming the other section for creating the ruckus. The political correctness is where the problem lies. If they were bipartisanly looking at this issue and they were able to call out both sides as issue makers and troublemakers, I do not think we would be having this kind of a conversation.
You don't seem satisfied, let alone satisfied. You don't even seem to be, even okay with the response of the Starmer government. So what do you think the way forward is going to be? Because on one hand, we are hearing statements like far-right thuggery will not be tolerated from the establishment. On the other hand, of course, there is this discontent that you're talking about. So what's the way forward for UK?
So the way forward for UK, in my opinion, is to keep that political correctness into the bin. So now, whether it's the far right or whether it's the Islamist gangs, if they are troublemakers, the right to policing, the right to use force should remain with the institutions in Britain. It should remain with the law enforcement agencies. The moment it goes down to the hands of the people or the rioters or the protesters, that's when the problem arises. And that's what we're seeing in Britain happen at this point of time. So the British polity, the institutions which have failed must take back control. They must assert themselves on the streets, and they must ensure that the streets are safe for pliers and common citizens like you and I or everybody else in Britain.
All right. And have you been hearing from the Indian community? Of course, we spoke about your wife being in London, but London, relatively speaking, is calm. But talking about other cities like Leicester, etc., what are you hearing from your friends?
So I've got friends in Leicester and Birmingham, and I was just speaking to them yesterday. They seem to be okay. I mean, they seem to be fairly untouched by the riots and the protests that have erupted. And bear in mind, Leicester in itself is slightly more secluded and is slightly more well governed post the Leicester riots that happened a couple of years ago. So there is
Right.
certainly that that amount of control that the government has been able to enforce in cities like Leicester and Birmingham. So I don't think they are so much of a problem. I think it's where there is a concentration of the white middle class who appear and perceive the polity to be pandering and sort of patronizing to a certain section, and while they themselves feel completely alienated, that's where we're seeing a lot of problems erupt.
All right. And if there were a couple of things which you could suggest, which will perhaps bring some sort of a resolution to this entire situation and help address the concerns of both sides, then what would those be? Because you've been in the UK for a while, you have your family living there as well.
So essentially, we need to ensure that the polity is able to understand the problems of the people. At this point, they appear completely disconnected to the actual whims and fancies of the people, what their demands are, what their core issues are. So the polity is not being able to understand the core issues of the people, and which is why they're struggling to establish control. So they need to understand, they need to have those engagements with the people. They need to understand if migration is an issue, if paying the bills for the illegal asylum seekers, if that's an issue, that needs to be addressed in a more systematic manner. The polity must take control of those issues and ensure that people feel part of the system, people feel encouraged to be part of the system.
By the way, do you fear that instead of doing that, the government's gonna come down with a heavy hand on the protesters?
Absolutely, that is what is happening. I mean, Keir Starmer's speech from a couple of days ago is
Yes.
completely reflecting of that. The
Yeah.
fact that he's saying that the far right thugs, the far right traveling thugs, are the bane of the problem, rather than addressing the issues on both sides. We've seen multiple videos erupt on social media, where there are Islamic gangs, there are Muslim gangs, which are also creating a lot of problems within British society. And British society is not used to this kind of thuggery, this kind of vandalism. It's a fairly moderate society at the end of it all. So they're not, they are having issues to grapple with this. And if the polity doesn't address these concerns, I fear that the issues will only quadruple from here on. So Keir Starmer has clearly not been able to address the issues. He's not been able to connect and resonate with the people. And today, he is on holiday as we speak. So that's where British politics is left at, Abhishek.
Right. So the honeymoon period for the Starmer government is already
Is over.
over, and this is a
Yeah,
serious issue that they have to deal with
yeah.
now. But thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking out the time and helping us figure out what's happening in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhishek.